vegetation in the Great Basin and in California. Erica, we're so pleased to have you on our forum tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Let me share my screen. Can you see that all right?
Can, yes.
Great. And I especially want to thank you for the invitation to talk with you and to say thank you for what the League of Women Voters does. My grandparents came through Ellis Island, and the only thing that was sacred in my household when I was growing up is that if you have a breath in your body, you vote. And the way that I was taught, you figure out who to vote for or what to vote for is you go get the League of Women Voters guide because it's nonpartisan and it's really good. So I just want to thank you because it's something that I feel obviously really strongly about. So thank you for all that you do. All right. I like to begin talking about climate change by talking about the fact that climate change is occurring against a backdrop of ongoing changes in land use and in population. And so many of you that are here tonight may be familiar with this notion of IPAT. That's kind of the way it's been labeled. And this is a notion that's been around for about 60 years. And it's not a literal equation, but the idea is that humans' effect on Earth is a function of how many people there are, how wealthy those people are, and technology. So in general, as people's affluence increases, their per capita effect on Earth also increases. And that can be moderated by technology, either up or down. So just keeping in mind that climate change is occurring, but the effects of climate change really are affected by what has been happening with human population and by humans' use of the world they live in for as long as there have been humans. We all would like climate to just adapt to us. We all would like the environment to just adapt to us. That's not the way it happens. We change the environment and then we have to adapt to the changes that we have created. So one of the major changes, and this was mentioned in the introduction, is that all of Oregon is becoming drier. It's been more pronounced in some parts of the state, but all of the state is becoming drier. Okay, alrighty here. All right, so what is contributing? Okay, the incidence, drought is becoming more frequent, drought is becoming longer, and drought is becoming more intense or severe. And that's a pattern that's held over the past 20 years and is likely to continue. That doesn't mean that we are never going to have wet years or have extremely wet years, but it means that the trend overall is to increasing drought, to increasing aridity. So what contributes to aridity? You probably would say, well, duh, it's precipitation. And it indeed has been quite dry over the past couple of years. The fact that it is raining now in where some of us are living does not change the fact that the past couple of winters have been quite dry. But the interesting thing is that, again, this is trend, so there are always going to be exceptions. Precipitation in Oregon overall and across most of the Western United States, if you look at a calendar year basis or a water year basis, the total amount of precipitation is fairly stable or even is increasing slightly. So what's going on? We're getting more precipitation in winter and less in summer. We're getting our precipitation more sporadically, so our winter storms are getting heavier. And one of the most important factors is that we're getting relatively more precipitation as rain and less as snow. And so what does this look like for Linn County? The actual number of wet days is not projected to increase considerably by the mid-century, but it plays out in terms of the amount of precipitation on the wettest day is likely to increase by about 14%. And the wettest consecutive 5-day period likely to see about a 10% increase. So again, total amount of precipitation across the year not changing, but precipitation becoming more episodic. And we can see some of these changes in rain versus snow playing out in terms of our snowpack. Snow water equivalent, you can just think of it as snowpack if you want. That measures how much water is in the snow. So if you think about making a snowball, when you can pack a nice tight snowball and whip it at people, that's high snow water equivalent. If snow is really fluffy, so the type of snow that we all like to ski in, relatively low snow water equivalent. But that, if you just want to think about it as snowpack for ease, the snowpack is really declining across the state as a whole. There are some regional differences, but by and large, we're getting less snow. And the snow that we get is peaking earlier, it's melting earlier. We have fewer days with snow cover, which has all kinds of consequences for agriculture and for native animals and plants. And there's a later start to the snow recreation season, which affects not only people who like to recreate, but obviously the tourism economy, and all of the communities that have built up around traditional winter recreation. So what else is happening? Obviously, the major effect on rain versus snow is increases in temperature. And so in Linn County, like much of the state, temperature has been increasing, and it's likely or definitely will continue increasing throughout mid-century and beyond. The difference here, what you can see in the reds versus the yellows, is the emission scenario. So the reds, the higher projected temperature increases, reflect what is projected to happen if the current trend of increase in emissions stays consistent, what sometimes is called business as usual. And the yellow reflects what is likely to happen if emissions are reduced to a fair extent. But it is going to continue warming. There's pretty much no doubt about that. What does this mean again for Linn County? About 17 more hot days per year by 2050 than we had over the past 30 years or so. In this case, we're defining hot as greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but whatever you consider hot, there are going to be more of those days. Also, what makes a big deal in terms of passive cooling, so energy use, and in terms of public health, is that the nights are, in a relative sense, warming more than the days. So less opportunity for any organism to cool off. This is also creating greater demand for air conditioning, which of course creates greater demand on the electricity grid. And without a major switch to renewable energy, then in turn creates this feedback where more fossil fuels are burned to keep us cool. Other contributors to aridity that I want to mention, wind speed, solar radiation, and humidity. Right now, it does not look like the frequency of high winds or wind speeds in general are likely to change much, if any, in Oregon and in Linn County as a result of climate change. So it's difficult to project wind, but right now it doesn't seem likely that wind patterns are going to change appreciably. However, wind does contribute to aridity. So as discussed in the introduction, one of the major changes that we're seeing with respect to increasing aridity is that aridity makes vegetation drier and it allows fires to spread more easily when they ignite. A lot of measures of vegetation dryness are correlated with the observed increase in the size of fires. In this case, I'm saying forests intentionally because of course we're all aware that lots of vegetation that isn't forest also burns, but fire sizes are becoming larger on the whole, and that has been correlated with trends and increases in the dryness of vegetation as drought becomes more common. It's also important to point out that vegetation dryness is not the only factor contributing to fires. Having high winds when fires start obviously is a major factor. We saw that in September 2020, and ignition sources. And the majority of fires across the West, there's variation from place to place and time to time, but the majority of ignitions now are created by human activity. That doesn't mean arson, it just means that wherever there are people, there are going to be sparks, whether it's from power lines or debris burning that gets out of hand, or kids being kids and playing with matches, what have you. But where there are people, there are going to be sparks. And so aridity means that those sparks are more likely to turn into fires and to turn into large fires. What you can see here is change in the number of days with high fire danger in the county. The metric that's underlying this is related to vegetation dryness. And so then what this means in terms of smoke is a really big deal. So the number of days on which there's considerable smoke in Linn County is not likely to change substantially. I mean, it's likely to change, it's likely to increase over the next 30 to 40 years. But what's really likely to change quite a bit is the intensity of smoke. So you can think of it as not necessarily having a much greater number of smoky days, but having much worse air quality on those days that are smoky. So that is what is projected. Unfortunately, major consequences, obviously, for public health, for people that have to work outside, for people that are unhoused, for people that have other vulnerable health conditions that make them more vulnerable. So I think that probably has used up my 10 minutes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you. And I look forward to a more open discussion following the other panelist presentations.
Okay, thank you, Erica. That was terrific. So now we'll move on to Will Tucker. Will has lived most of his life in rural Linn County. He has served in the Navy Reserve, and Army Reserve, and has worked for Hewlett-Packard for 29 years and as a real estate broker for 6 years, following which he has served as Linn County Commissioner since 2008, with one brief break before his reappointment in April of 2021. Will has served on many nonprofit county and state boards. He was elected to represent 6 counties to the Oregon Department of Forestry. He was appointed by the Secretary of Interior to represent Northwest Oregon counties on the Bureau of Land Management's Resource Advisory Council. And he was appointed by the Secretary of Agriculture to represent Southern Willamette counties on the Willamette Forest Service Resource Advisory Council. And I know for certain that Will has been out in the field many days, taking care of observing the ravages, especially of those fires that we had in 2020, and dealing with and helping the people who were injured and affected by those fires. So Will, please take it away.
Thanks, Robert. In fact, the last phone call I was on was dealing with 3 people who are underinsured and trying to get their solutions solved, but they're so woefully underinsured they need help. I luckily get to speak about the response and preparations to events caused by global warming, and not about, I really don't want to go there. I feel like an ostrich with my head in the sand sometime as I think about global warming. But I do comment about global warming, and that's plant a tree. Plant trees every day, everywhere, whenever you can. Help us plant them in the forest because they sequester carbon, they release oxygen, and they are a great asset to have for cooling this earth. So one thing we should think about as we look at these last fires was how lucky Linn County was. If you took the Beachy Creek fire that started it up and dropped that centering point, now in the Menagerie Wilderness, Lebanon and Sweet Home would be gone, and the fire would have gone over towards Scio and gone into Scio. If you were to take the fire that was wind caused, and that was lightning caused, if you took the one that was wind caused or man caused, because it was transformer lines, called Holiday Farm, and picked it up from the Blue River area and dropped it up by Cascadia, it was narrower, but it went more south, so it would have gone out and taken out Brownsville and Sweet Home, and risked the edges of Lebanon. So we've been very lucky, but at the same time, our forest is drying. If you drive over Highway 20 in the summer, you'll see lots of brown needles where there used to be green needles, and you see we're losing trees along the highways from that absorbed and reflected heat from the highways. The combination of COVID and wildfires showed us some holes. As a commissioner, I have binders for lots of topics, budgets for all sorts of things. And one of those binders is disaster planning. And you can open up to that binder and you can look up fire, you can look up severity, and you could read who you should call, what you should do, what resolutions we need to pass to get state health, federal health. It's really great, but the plans were written as if we're going to have one disaster, be done with a disaster, and voila, we do the next disaster. So we'd have a flood, then later on next year we'd have a fire, and then someplace down the road. But the reality is, with COVID and the
Well, it looks like we may have lost Will.
in September of 2020,
Oh.
I still
Yeah,
show my ugly puss there.
your internet's
And
just
I
going in and out a little bit. I think I'm just going to turn off your video, but you can continue
Great.
to talk.
Turn off my video, that'll
Okay.
save a little bandwidth.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you. So what I was going to say was, remember at the same time we had both COVID and that fires burned basically from Clackamas County all the way down to the California border on the response systems and what we had planned. Our plan, when you open up the fire evacuation plan, it talks about contact American Red Cross, tell them which school, church, or fairgrounds you're opening, and they will supply sheltering staff and equipment. But when we called them at 7:30 in the morning on that day, we were already the 7th county to call. We were on the list, but all of the counties that are larger than us had denser populations. All of those counties got the resources. It was over a week before they could put together a team of flying people in that could possibly take over our sheltering efforts. And so that was also a shock for us. We've not had our disasters at the same time the rest of the state is in the middle of wildfires. It's also worth noting that Red Cross would not manage a shelter like we ran. We ran a shelter at Linn County. We ran one in Benton County at the fairgrounds as well. And we had some at some parks. Red Cross does not handle cows, horses, sheep, goats, chickens, guinea pigs. Red Cross will do limited dogs and cats, as well as it was the pandemic. And they wanted us to put everybody into hotels and did not want us to have what they call a congregate site. But we were already sending people up to Clackamas, Yamhill, and all the way up to Portland for hotel rooms, trying to place everybody. So it is amazing to see what happens when we have something the scope and size of the 2020 fires on top of a pandemic. And I want you to think about that when we talk about other disasters in a minute. The last general conversation is the fact that these challenges of having animals is really a challenge for all of us. And it's something you as individual animal and pet owners and lovers need to think about, that hotels oftentimes will take in 1 dog, 2 dogs, maybe a dog and a cat, but they don't like birds. They certainly don't want pigs. They don't want so many things that as you get ready to respond to a disaster and think about what's going to happen, you need to know that your critters are something you need to be thinking about ahead of time. And you need to have somebody, if you live in Scioto, that lives in Brownsville, and someone who you live in Sweet Home, maybe someone lives in Albany, that you can move your flocks, and you might be better served by moving your animals there. In fact, we created, out of the necessity of this fire, we created a tool that people could list what resource they had. So I have 5 barn stalls available for horses. I have pasture land fenced for cattle. But that tool was really great. But again, it's something you should think about before we get there, is what are you going to do with your animals and how best can you take care of them? Knowing that the fairgrounds could have housed more people in the congregate site, but our parking lots were full, front, back, and streets, with cars and people with their dogs and cats, because it was a place they could bring their animals. So the major things about the impacts of climate change are scary. They scare me a lot. But the thing that I'm also worried about is the effect of having more than one at a time. And having said that, I've been trained by Red Cross to do disaster planning. And I speak on disaster planning, and I'll come to your church, I'll come to your school, I'll come to your neighborhood watch, I'll come to whatever group you can put together. And I have a 45-minute presentation from American Red Cross that talks about how to prepare yourself for disaster. But I want you to think about the fact that we're well overdue for the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. And if that earthquake was that 2nd or 3rd disaster, so we've got this earthquake and a tsunami, and we have a major snow event. We have a pandemic with major fires, and then at the same time, then the earthquake hits, and maybe it's not even as bad as they predict it could be. But who's really ready for a tornado in a major rain event while we have an earthquake? And I can tell you that we certainly aren't. So just know that as this changing world goes on, we are looking at more events, more frequent, but we still have that one major disaster that's hanging out there, which is the Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes. So one of the things that we found that was shocking as we went through this disaster that we hadn't considered in any of our plans was communication. Our binder talked about how important it was to hold nightly meetings at the shelter. It talked about how important it was to have signboards that showed maps of fires and locations and pictures and all those things we could put up. But we had a major problem that people couldn't get access up the canyon to cell phones. They couldn't get access to radios. that we've actually had a real problem. That's a real change that needs to be thought about. All of us should have an AM radio with batteries ready someplace in our house, because the lack of cell towers and the hours and days that cell towers can run without being resupplied could be a problem. So just know that you have an obligation, all of us, to stay in touch. And AM and FM radio is a pretty easy way. And we use the radio stations every single morning, K-Will, K-Gal, and one up the canyon to get out the word to the neighbors. I'd like to ask you to think about what you've done in the past about disasters. You live in a neighborhood, you could have dozens of neighbors or hundreds of neighbors, but those neighbors really are connections. So think about, who are your close friends of your neighbors? Where's your extended family? How can you work together on getting things done? Who's getting grandma? If you live in North Albany, but your kids go to school in Albany, who's going to get the kids if the bridge goes down? When we had ice storms a couple of years ago and you couldn't get out of Albany on the bridges, that caused major panic with people calling the courthouse. Our lines were buried at 911 and the courthouse with, when will the road be open? What's happening? Is a major challenge, because it is something we need to think about, is what plans can you make ahead of time to get yourself ready to respond to how to get grandma, how to get the kids home. But one of the things that the Scioto community I lived in taught me was that we need to have the ability to have our neighbors and us understand what each of us have as a skill. One of my neighbors, a man named Boone Brown, would have an annual picnic. At his annual picnic, we did a little bit of neighborhood watch discussions about crime that may have occurred, but it always got into who has what new skill or what new piece. When the power would go out, because we were on a co-op out there, we could go out for weeks. Knowing who had a generator, who you could take your frozen, your material out of your freezer to, was really critical. Who has a welder? My friend Boone was in his 70s, even though very, very outgoing, he needed help sometimes running the tractor to pick the trees off the road when they came down. Knowing who has what in your neighborhood, whatever it may be, who is the person that has the handy tools, who has the drill press, who has those things. It's pretty critical that you know your neighbors. Depending upon the size and scope of the disasters, it can quickly overload us. We don't have everything for everybody. So if you think about the Tornado Valley in the central of the United States, and those living in the south facing hurricanes, those counties, those states do the same thing we have to do, which is declare a disaster. Get the governor to declare a disaster, to get FEMA to accept that disaster before resources really start to come. And don't get me wrong, we had tremendous resources. We actually had the Albany Fire Department dispatching fire trucks before they were called and asked to send them. They already had fire trucks going through Scioto on their way up the mountain on that Tuesday morning. And so it is amazing how well connected we are, but it is a process and it takes a while, and we don't have enough beds. I would need 135,000 beds to put everybody someplace. I don't have enough churches, schools, and the fairgrounds to put up more than a few hundred, probably close to about 2,000, but I only own 200 plus cots. The rest of you are going to be sleeping on the floor. I don't have enough food. We have enough food for our emergency responders for a few days and freeze-dried food, but we don't have enough food to feed 100,000 people. And so it's really critical for you to think about how you can help us serve you. So planning is critical. I mentioned a little bit about Red Cross. They have a great preparedness class. They can come to you. Our friends in Lebanon is a group called Live Longer Lebanon. They have a working group on preparation. Those places will help you get your thoughts wrapped together into a plan. The Red Cross class is a book, but there's also other groups out there call them Medical Reserve Corps. The Linn County Medical Reserve Corps were all the volunteers that gave the shots out at the fairgrounds and traveled around the county giving shots in every city in the county. That Medical Reserve Corps is all volunteers. And you don't have to be a nurse. You don't have to be a doctor. They even put me to work one day a week being a greeter. They need people to help park, to pass out forms, to organize lines. We needed them when we had the people camping out at the fairgrounds during the fire. We need them. But this preparation work that I want you to do is critical, because every time there was a flood in Scioto, and that's where my family lived for years, every time there was a flood in Scioto, there would be a run to the hardware store and he would be out of plastic, rolls of plastic. But every one of us should have a roll of plastic or two if we own our home, because the reality is in a windstorm, roofs are going to be damaged. In an earthquake, roofs are going to be damaged. In a tornado, roofs are going to be damaged. And the Red Cross class is about what to put in your first aid, not in your first aid kit, but in your emergency kit for the box of the house. It doesn't talk about your house and structure, but a couple of those events, like even fires, can damage your windows, but your house, you could possibly sleep in it. And if we had a major fire that came through, we had people sleeping in their homes after they were burned out, refusing to evacuate because they were afraid of people, and people did go up there and steal from those homes. So this whole planning disasters is really, really unique and specialized, not specialized, but it's individualized. My needs are different than your needs. So you need to think about your children. How old are they? Do you need Pampers? I need my high blood pressure medicine. I'm a hyperactive attention deficit type of guy, and I bounce off of walls, but I need to make sure that I have that medicine. It took us 2 days to get we had our own drugstore by the time we were done, but it took us 2 days to get our own drugstore and pharmacy set up at the fairgrounds. Know that standing up mobile pharmacies takes a few minutes, and you have to go through this whole medical process about who can prescribe and who can release and who can order those meds. It was amazing. They actually let me order prescription drugs. It was amazing that they allowed me to manage the prescription process to make those things happen each night. When I mentioned about Red Cross, I'm sorry?
Will, that's terrific. That's a really great message you're giving us, that preparation is all of our responsibilities. I'm glad to, and it's not just something that we should expect others to do, but we need to do it for ourselves. I think that's a really important message, and I really thank you for that.
Right. I thought I had 15 minutes before, but I was trying. I know. I was scribbling and crossing things off to get it down to 10. But thank you, Robert, for cutting me off. And I would be available to come again to anyone who's out there. If you have an employer, if you have a group, call me. I'll come.
You can take a couple of my minutes, Will. I'm not going to take more than 10.
I'm good. We'll see where the questions go.
Yeah, I think we'll have plenty of discussion based on some of the questions that we're seeing. So once again, thank you so much, Commissioner Tucker. And now we'll be moving on to Peter Carnegie. So Peter is a lifelong resident, farmer and land manager in the Albany area. With his family, he owns and operates a 450-acre diversified farm along the Willamette River, adjacent to the Albany city limits in Benton County. And I hope to hear from Peter a little more about what they're growing. I know he and I've had a great discussion about asparagus once before. So look forward to hearing firsthand what Peter's been observing on his farm and what he is thinking about for the future. Peter?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad I'm following Erica and Will, and I appreciated both of your presentations. I'm going to start off a little bit with talking about just what I've observed in my 60+ year history in Oregon. It's obvious that our weather is changing, patterns have shifted, and patterns have historically shifted in geologic time. I mean, there's lots of reasons for weather to change, but it's also obvious that the human impact has had a significant and probably ever increasing impact on that change. And, from a specific standpoint, what I have noticed, drier falls, less cold weather. I mean, it's been a lot of years since we've had a week of freezing weather. We don't get the deep freezes that we used to get, and I was glad to hear, really glad to hear Will talk about disaster and bring up the subduction zone quake, because that is when you look at the big picture, if you pile one disaster on top of another is when we can really, really end up with a mess. And it's, I guess in terms of my farming operation, I can't, things shift gradually. There's only so much we can do to change it. And we just kind of roll with what happens. And fortunately for me, being right along the Willamette River, unlike a lot of the farmers in other areas of the country that are much more water limited, the Klamath Basin, lots of places in Eastern Oregon, where, I'm fairly well in pretty good shape from a irrigation standpoint compared to an awful lot of people in other parts of the state. But I do really, when you see what happens, the flooding that happened in BC this year, the flooding that happened in Washington, and most recently in Australia, at some point we're going to get a big flood here. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And, one of the things that, my father moved on to this farm in 1936. And the floods that happened here, and he was very aware of the floods. And prior to the dams, there were big floods here that impacted a lot of areas that have been built on. And we've kind of grown a little bit complacent. We have those flood control dams, but they're not perfect, and they're subject to human error. And if we ever get a really big event and then it's compounded by either fires in the preceding year or God forbid, a subduction zone quake, which is going to happen at some point. We could really, really be significally impacted. And, one of the things that I really appreciated about what Erica said when she started out, I equals PAT, population, affluence, and technology. And she said that was something that had been around for 60 years. And I honestly had never heard that equation put out like that. And I appreciate that because, we have a tech has not kept up with either our population or our affluence. And, we have a lot of things to address. And I'm not real optimistic for my kids' future and where we're headed. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's, I'm going to be dead within 20 years. So somebody else is going to have to deal with it. So, but that's probably as much as I want to say. And so I'll turn it back over to you, Robert.
Well, before I let you go, Peter, I was wondering if you could tell us anything about what changes in farming practices or crop selections that you might envision in the near future.
Well, our cropping systems have changed, and it's not so much due to the changing climate, but to the changing economics. We used to be processed vegetable growers. We used to grow for Norpac, and Norpac went bankrupt, and so we had to shift. And so we shifted more into the feed production. a little bit of direct marketing, but you take that year by year, and you don't make changes fast. You adapt as time goes by, and you stay diversified enough that if something doesn't work you have enough diversity that, hopefully something is a winner every year. And for those of you that don't know, I mean, we manage 450 acres just outside the city limits of Albany. We're all in Benton County. It's the bulk of it is annual floodplain. A lot of it is subject to winter flooding, annual winter flooding. Our house sits, when we built our house on this site, we built it well above what the county required us. But when you look at, my dad did a lot of elevation checking on the historic floods. And if you look back at the 1865 flood, from where I'm sitting right here in my office, the 1865 flood would have had water, 2 feet over my head. And, that theoretically is a real possibility at some point. And, that's going to be a real disaster when that happens. So.
All right, thank you. So pretty much you're responding more to market forces from year to year, but those market forces in addition could be responding to climate changes and changes overall in the environment. So, one affects the other.
Yeah, no, and last year, the heat we had in June really significantly impacted some of our crops, and our yields on certain things were way down. But, the plus side of that was that the markets were good. And so we still did okay, even though our yields were down.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter. And we'll get back to you when we have when we address some of these questions. Okay. Now I would like to introduce Megan Kemple. Megan is the co-director of the Oregon Climate and Agriculture Network, also called ORCAN. Throughout her 20 years of nonprofit experience, she has focused on supporting Oregon's agricultural community. ORCAN works with farmers to build a regenerative agricultural economy in Oregon that is rooted in community and thrives through disruptions big and small. Megan's work with ORCAN emphasizes policy advocacy, primarily at the state level, to advance climate resilience for Oregon's farmers and ranchers. So, Megan, we're ready for you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be sharing a little bit of perspective on how we can advance climate resilience on Oregon's farms and ranches. And this is about both how farms can be part of the solution to the problem of climate change, as well as how they can become more resilient to climate change, to the impacts of climate change. And with Oregon Climate and Ag Network, our mission is to advance climate resilience on farms in Oregon through collaboration, education, and policy advocacy, and really consistent with Peter's presentation and the other messages that we've been hearing. We know that farmers are on the front lines of climate change, both in terms of the impacts and having the potential to be part of the solution. And the extreme drought and heat of 2021, as an example, put farmers, our food system, and our communities at risk. And at the same time, soil carbon sequestration, which we'll talk a little bit more about, provides one of the most ready, cost-effective pathways for carbon sequestration as a climate mitigation strategy. And ag practices that sequester carbon in the soil also have multiple benefits, co-benefits to our farms and our communities, and I'll share a little bit more about that. So we know that for farmers and ranchers in Oregon, the resilience of the economy and the community and the environment are interconnected with each other. What is farming for climate resilience? It's not a single practice or a rigid methodology. Farming for climate resilience requires a holistic approach that includes a diverse set of management practices. They're well laid out here, and each farm and ranch with its own geography, conditions, and management needs can find solutions that work. Some of the 4 key principles include maximizing continuous living roots in the soil, minimizing disturbance. Many of you have probably heard of no-till or reduced-till ag, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing soil cover with mulches and reduced tillage, again with cover crops and green manures, for example. And in terms of what some of the practices look like, some additional practices: no-till and reduced tillage, cover cropping, compost application, rotational grazing, crop rotation, nutrient management, hedgerow and riparian plantings, silvopasture and agroforestry, so planting trees on farms and planting crops in conjunction with trees. And the beautiful thing about these practices is that they have multiple co-benefits, and they have benefits to in terms of climate mitigation. So healthy soils practices, the practice of keeping roots in the soil, of keeping the soil covered, has the potential to sequester carbon in the soil. So draw down carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the soil. But at the same time, these practices improve productivity, soil productivity, increase soil health, so they can increase moisture holding capacity. There, with that increased soil health is a need for fewer inputs. Planting trees on farms and along stream banks on farms can improve fish and wildlife habitat, for example, or riparian buffers and hedgerows can provide wildlife habitat, for example. And all of that has the potential to increase profitability of farms when inputs are reduced, for example. So when farms need, and just to be clear, since not everybody here is real familiar with ag, so when I say inputs, that could mean there may be a need for fewer fertilizers, for example, or fewer pest problems as farms become more resilient. And that means, so a need for fewer inputs means saving money and a potential for increased profitability. So there we go. Some of the strategies. So how can we support farmers in implementing these practices? It really needs to come from our farmers and be shared between farmers. So we know that it's really valuable to look at whole farm planning and look at practices that have multiple benefits. So increasing soil health or increasing water retention, for example, promoting perennials. Some examples of some of the, we know that rotational grazing for pasture and range management is really critical. And promoting a little bit more about perennials, particularly on field borders, from silvopasture projects to riparian forest buffers to protecting perennial grasses in grazing systems. There are all kinds of practices that really all kinds of farmers and ranchers can implement. And it can be really valuable when farmers are able to layer multiple practices. So implement multiple practices, combining, for example, combining no-till with cover cropping and compost application or grazing cover crops. And the piece that I'm really here, you know, I am not a farmer, and ORCAN's role is to support our ag community and those who support our farmers so that resources flow to our farmers in the way that's valuable. And we recognize that a lot of the farmers that we've been engaged with, and that we've had multiple listening sessions engaging with our farmers in our network, and have learned that there's a need that many farmers really appreciate and see a need for technical assistance. And there's a need for research, there's a need for outreach and education as well. And so ORCAN plays a role to try to bring those things to our farmers in a way that is strategic and effective. And one of the pieces that my work is really focused on our policy solutions. And so I want to share some opportunities with you here. The Oregon Global Warming Commission is a commission at the statewide level whose mission is to recommend ways to coordinate state and local efforts to reduce Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions and to help state and local governments and businesses and Oregonians prepare for the effects of climate change. So both to mitigate climate change and help us prepare. And last fall, the Global Warming Commission released its Natural and Working Lands proposal, a proposal providing recommendations for strategies to advance carbon sequestration on Oregon's natural and working lands, including our farms and ranches. And ORCAN was quite involved in providing input on the proposal, and some of the recommendations from the proposal were that the state should promote climate smart practices, promote farmer to farmer learning. So here I am speaking about what farmers might need while Peter is here at the table. So I'm really glad that Peter was able to share about what he's experiencing and what farmers need. But we know that farmers learn best from other farmers. And so farmer to farmer learning, sharing soil health success stories. So when a farmer is doing really great, effective work to promote climate resilience, to share that story out with other farmers. And then we recognize that to implement some of these practices, farms need a little extra financial support. And so we're also working to, the proposal, the Global Warming Commission's proposal also recognize the need for financial incentives in addition to all of these other things. And so what can be done to advance the recommendations in the proposal? We can pass state legislation or secure federal funding to advance carbon sequestration and resilience on Oregon's farms and ranches. And that again could include funding for technical assistance from the state and state agency partners, farmer to farmer education, and financial incentives. And we just had a go at a bill this last legislative session to really lay a framework for advancing carbon sequestration and resilience on Oregon's farms and ranches. And it was our first run with the policy, and it was during a very short session, which is only 5 weeks long, and it did not pass, unfortunately. So ORCAN and our partners and the League of Women Voters, actually, Oregon League of Women Voters at the statewide level, has been advocating for advancing this policy. And we'll be coming back to the legislature next session to work to implement this, implement some components at least of this program, the Climate Smart Ag program. And so you can get engaged if you're interested with League of Women Voters work related to natural and working lands at the statewide level. And you could also, if you'd like to engage real directly in either this policy work or supporting our farmers on the ground, you could get engaged with ORCAN's work. And I'm going to just pop into the chat a link where you can, I'll put our website in there, but I'll also just pop in a link where you can complete a simple survey about your interests and how you might like to engage in our work, whether it's through the education program or policy advocacy or otherwise. And that's it for my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Megan. That's great work that you're up to, and I think we got a quick seminar on best practices or for farming in an era of climate change. So now is the time that we'll begin to address the questions that have been presented both on the chat and in the Q&A. And the first one to address that came in is, how will the passage of Senate Bill 762, the wildfire bill passed last year, affect new home construction in areas identified in Linn County as wildland urban interface and at high wildfire risk? So
I've unmuted. I guess it's coming to me. So 762 did a lot of things, and some money is coming for fire hardening. It is not yet clear. In fact, we just signed a memorandum of understanding. So this passed in over a year ago, signed by the governor over a year ago. We just signed a memorandum of understanding with the construction contractor boards that we're going to work with them on doing things. If I look at other things that are in that program, they talk about high risk for wildfire areas. They don't identify Linn, Lane, Marion, Clackamas counties as being high risk. Those areas are in Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon. So the answer is that I'm not seeing much effect. Having said that, for the first time in my 14 years in office, the state fire marshal and the ODF team came down just the other day to meet with Linn County to talk about, we have many homes that don't have fire protection out in the rural urban forest interfaces. They are not part of a fire district. And so we're going to start working on trying to get people into fire districts to make sure that they have proper fire coverage, because some people's houses who burned didn't have fire coverage and they're liable for their fire costs. But having said that, that's the only actual, besides the memorandum of understanding with the construction contracting board, that's the only things we've seen so far has been paperwork. And then we have a project for this summer where we're going to go out and talk to about 70 homes in Linn County about the fact they don't have any fire services. But there's been nothing done yet. They're working on windows, they're working on roofing, they're working on lots of things that are going to change in the code, but that's nothing that we've seen that's active yet. And not a single dollar's come to the people who are rebuilding the homes because of the wildfire.
So Will, was there any funding in that bill to be applied where you see it needed?
No. I hate to say that, but no. In fact, for this session, my biggest thing, people wanted to work on the 2020 fire response, and the answer was no. I want to work on the 2022 fire response, but no.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's see, I have one here of for Peter. How can consumers best support farmers to be sustainable and resilient? What besides joining a CSA is most helpful?
A CSA only is going to be beneficial to a small subset of farmers. Most of the farmers in Oregon, that are commercial of any kind of a scale, are not going to rely on a CSA, and they have their place, but it's that's a hard question for me to answer. And I guess, from my standpoint, it is support good land use planning. Let's make our societies and our communities efficient. Let's put our housing in areas that don't impact agricultural zones. Let's keep them where we can provide services efficiently, where they are resilient to natural disasters. So out of the floodplains, keep them out of the areas where they're impacted by the negative, the dust that I saw somebody mention dust. There are certain things that go, as much as we want to talk about, cover crops and no-till and compost, all of those are good things. But when you look at the diversities of crops that are raised here, not all those things work in all cropping systems. Not all of them are practical in all cropping systems. And, one of the things that people have to realize that, no-till is dependent on herbicide applications. And you go to no-till, you end up with more potentially more disease pressure on certain crops. You end up with larger vole problems. You can end up with insect and disease problems. It's not a simple thing to sort out. But I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but it's probably about the best I can do.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Peter. Megan, and anyone else, but let's start with Megan. Would you like to also respond to that question?
I would listen to our farmers in terms of asking them what they need. But yes, I'll just reflect a little bit on how we can support our farmers. I really appreciated what Peter said about we can support our farmers financially. So he didn't, that wasn't his message exactly, but I want to just connect this here. We can support our farmers financially so they are viable. So they have resources to implement the practices that they feel are best for their soils and their livelihoods. And so that our farmers are able to continue farming, and farmland is protected. And so farmland protection is actually a really key climate mitigation strategy. So if an acre of farmland has far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than an acre of developed urban or suburban land. And so keeping our farms farming both allows that land to have lower climate impact, but also gives those farmers the opportunity to, we can't sequester carbon on farms if there aren't any farms. So we need our farms in order to provide that opportunity. So let's keep supporting our farmers, both by protecting farmland and by supporting them financially.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. Erica, do you have something to contribute to that discussion? All right.
I think it's been said really well.
Okay.
No, I don't, except I agree with protecting farmland and ranch land. Ag land needs to be clearly not impacted by the growth of urban, and we need to manage those two things very, very carefully.
Okay, so our next question, one we received before the forum began, was, what is the single most important thing an individual can do to reduce one's carbon footprint? What can individuals do beyond driving electric cars, installing solar panels, and the 3 R's of reduce, reuse, and recycle to make a bigger dent in the climate problem?
Die young.
So Peter, I'm not with you there. I'm still planning to go for 100.
My mom was too, and boy, I'm glad she didn't make it.
So I'd say, if you have the right to vote, vote, because there are individual actions, but there's also policies that in the aggregate have a greater effect than individuals can have by the personal choices that they make. And individuals can have an effect, but there's also policy that happens at the national level, at the state level. And so talking to the people that represent you, even if you don't have the right to vote, let them know that this matters to you, Let them know what kinds of policies you support, the extent to which you're willing to pay more for certain things to do that if you have the capacity to do it. But talking to people about changes in policies that you support, I think, is the greatest action an individual can have. It's not just a matter of the day-to-day actions, but supporting change that goes beyond the individual, that needs to happen at the government level and at the society level.
I just want to kind of second that in addition, we can support I think a lot about the food system. That's my world. So just thinking about how we can support climate friendly ag practices by supporting farmers who are practicing climate resilience. And I really want to just second what Erica said, that I think policy change has the potential to make really significant impact and institutional impact. And so brings about institutional change that's needed. And so getting engaged in policy, and it's not that hard. I guess I could just take a few minutes or just a second to just let y'all know that there are opportunities to engage of course, at the local level and at the state level and federal level. And some of those are a lot more accessible to us, but it's really empowering and can be pretty fun to engage with policy at the state and local level, meeting with our legislators and expressing ourselves so that we feel heard and that policy reflects our needs. So just want to encourage y'all to get engaged as you're comfortable. And there are lots of organizations, including League of Women Voters, that can help you do that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? All right. Let's see, we already had a mention of this question earlier. What is the impact of the huge clouds of topsoil loss into the air each year? Does no-till or low-till help?
Do you want to take that?
I'll start out on that one, and it does definitely help. I probably was one of the earliest experimenters with no-till in the valley. 30 some years ago, I bit the bullet and spent a bunch of money on a no-till drill, and spent a lot of time experimenting with how to reduce tillage. And back at that point, when we were looking, I was involved with soil health, long-term soil quality study with OSU, and read a lot of stuff, went to no-till conferences back in the Midwest. And, it's been a good thing for me, but for our diversified cropping rotation, no-till does not work for all crops. Certain crops, when you have small seed that you need to get into a mineral seed bed without residue, you just about have to till. And there's always going to be some dust with farming. There are ways to minimize it, but we're never going to eliminate it. And, because there's going to have to be some tillage, and there's always, the harvest operations and combining, flailing and all that stuff all creates dust. I mean, there's no way to get around it. There's no way to get around eliminating dust 100%.
One other piece, just to acknowledge the potential challenges of no-till practices, just keeping the soil covered, by keeping roots in the ground, and with cover crops is a great way also to protect the soil and keep that wind erosion, for example, from impacting our farmland as much.
And I will make a point on cover crops and the cropping systems, the predominant cropping systems we have in the valley. The largest acreages we have here are grass seed. And a grass seed is, in essence, it's a cover crop because you plant it in the fall, you plant it on a dryland system. And typically there's no space in a grass seed system for a cover crop. They work if you're doing a summer annual crop and, not going to have something planted in the winter. But if you're doing a fall plant crop, you really, even if you harvest your crop early in the season, if you harvest it in June or July and you plant in September or October, you have a couple of months in there, but you don't have water unless you want to spend money on electricity and an irrigation system to put in a cover crop for a couple of months. And there's not a whole lot of sense in that to expend that kind of energy to fit a cover crop in a grass seed system.
Okay, great. That's it for dust. I have a couple of tree related questions. I'll put them together. So how can we organize our communities to plant more trees along streets and parks and elsewhere, and to help mitigate the effects of warmer summers? And why can't we use our county forests for carbon uptake and storage? So I'll just throw that out to everyone to take a stab at.
So I'll take a stab at the county forest. So the county forest is a couple hundred acres. And so our county forests are very, very small. The county forests that we have that are state forests that are under the trust lands, and there's some that's not trust land, but the forests that are managed by the state, they get to be a few percent of our total land base. And those are continually planted by trees. They have, after the fire, they have actually cleared the roads. They've taken down dangerous trees, and they've actually sold some sales of standing dead trees, and they're reforesting. BLM have opened their roads and cleared their roads and cleared their right-of-ways, including dangerous trees. And they've done a handful of sales as well. And they're just now starting to reforest. Private timber has cleared their properties and has almost completed their reforestation. The U.S. Forest Service, the largest owner, has not cleared the roads, has not cleared the right-of-ways, has not cleared the dangerous trees, has not cut down any of the standing dead, does not have plans yet for reforestation. They're actually coming to see us in a few weeks at the county commission, so you'll see that in the paper.
Thank you, Will. Any other comments on tree planting and in communities?
The comment I would make there is that, I started planting trees on my farm, in the riparian areas and the non-crop areas, 35, close to 40 years ago. And, I made a lot of mistakes. I planted a lot of trees where they shouldn't be, and I'm paying for it now with shade on my fields. Poor design. I didn't know what in the hell I was doing. I was shooting in the dark. And, I've learned a lot, and I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the 125 acres of riparian area, timber, and off-channel habitats that are included on our farm resilient and good wildlife habitat. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and I don't get paid for any of that. And one of my biggest frustrations is that I have a right adjacent to me, just between our farm and the bridges across the Willamette in Albany, is a 125-acre Tahkeena Landing Park owned by the city of Albany. That they invest no money into that. It's being overtaken by, I mean, ivy. It's covered with blackberries. The city of Albany is going to spend $16 million to spiff up their riverfront on that side, but they're not willing to spend $10,000 or $20,000 in maintenance on their parkland to keep it in good shape. And putting pressure on the city of Albany, from a local standpoint, to take care of their natural lands would be a good place to start.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Megan, any thoughts on like silviculture or even permaculture in the practices that you've been working with?
Well, I just really want to honor and acknowledge Peter's effort and planting trees along creek beds in a way that is, done in a way that works for farmers over the long term in terms of being able to continue to grow crops well is a really important strategy. Agroforestry is becoming more and more recognized as a potential, having potential for improving climate resilience as well as sequestering carbon. I really want to just highlight the importance of planting trees and perennials on farms. So if you can imagine, we can talk about planting cover crops and we can talk about no-till, and that can help to increase carbon in the soil. But if you think about a way to draw down carbon from the atmosphere and put it into the soil and keep it deep in the ground and keep it in roots that are truly not disturbed, trees and perennial shrubs are the best way to do that. And so hedgerows on farms, riparian buffers are a really great strategy there. And then agroforestry is something that more farms are exploring. So in silvopasture. So there are some examples in Oregon of hazelnut orchards with animals integrated, for example, pigs integrated into hazelnut orchards. And we have some other pretty great examples around the state, and there's an opportunity there.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Let's see. Linda, you're saying that we should begin to wrap up?
Yeah.
Oh.
Wait. What? You want to do one more question?
Yeah, I had one, which is, can someone recommend a book or website that has a list of specific foods to store for emergencies? I guess following on Will's discourse on individual responsibility for preparedness.
Let me talk for a second about that, and I'll try and make it quick, Robert. So if you were to go on OPB, do a search on the Great Shake and how long it'll be before the roads recover, before the gas lines and things recover, it's days and weeks. We're being told by the state to expect to have 1 to 2 weeks before they're flying food into Albany. And so we have some period of time where we're all going to have to live out of our pantries and live out of food stocks that are around. We're lucky we have a large food bank in Tangent that will be able to help us. There's only a few days supply there for us, but it is days of supplies. And so I don't have a good book about what to do in terms of the Red Cross class talks about buying the things you eat. And so buy a case of tomato sauce and store it in the garage. And when you need tomato sauce in the house, you pull that case in and you buy another case of tomato sauce in the garage. I don't have a good book, but to me, it's logical, that Red Cross sort of concept of buy the things you eat. Watch how you rotate them, because it does no good. When we got masks during the beginning of the pandemic from the state of Oregon, they were mouse eaten and stunk of urine. And some of them that didn't stink, the elastics snapped the second you put them on your face. They were so old. So whatever you store for your emergency, think about how you're going to rotate things through them. So it does no good to have your batteries in a flashlight, have the flashlight batteries eat the flashlight alive. So back to the food. Buy the foods you eat. Someone thought that there was a good resource from CDC, and so in the chat, there's someone there who gave a website that had a place on CDC. I've not seen a good one, but I try to plan menus. But I also am a crazy wackadoodle. I have a generator that can run for a month and keep my freezer going, and my neighbors know that they can come plug their freezers in my garage, and I can keep a bunch of freezers going for a small fee of a little bit of salmon or whatever you might have that I don't have in mind. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Will. That's great. Okay, so, gosh, and I think this has been a great discussion. Kind of in summary, Erica let us all know that warming is in our future, and the consequences of warming are aridity and changes in the distribution of moisture in our environment. Will let us know that preparedness is not only a county responsibility or a community or city responsibility, it's also an individual responsibility and a neighborhood responsibility, that we should all be thinking ahead, thinking about the future and preparing and planning for it. Peter gave us some great insight into what it's been like being a farmer right in the middle of Willamette Valley on the Willamette River, and some of the changes that he's seen, the change in winter temperatures and moisture, and but concerns about what kind of flooding or alterations in the flood and drought cycle we may be looking at in the future. And then we had Megan, who gave us a really terrific overview of what in farming practices and agricultural overall what changes could potentially make our whole agricultural and food system more resilient towards climate change and warming in the future. Thank you all for contributing so much. And then Linda had something she wanted to mention.
Yeah, before you go, take a look at the chat if you haven't done that. Peggy Lynch of the League of Women Voters put in some information, an update about SB 762 and sources of more information about that.
So if you have other questions about Senate Bill 762, Peggy Lynch is ready to answer them for you. So on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Linn County, I thank you all for participating, our panelists, as well as all of the people who have been online watching. I hope that we can do many more forums in the future on topics of interest in our county and our local communities. So once again, thank you all, and thank you to Amanda at the League of Women Voters office for running this this forum for us on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and
Thank
good
you all.
night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.